It was late in the evening of September 22nd, 1908, when the survivors returned to Wrangell. Just days before, there had been so many. Now, there were so few. Of the 138 men who set sail aboard the Star of Bengal, only 27 survived. Most of the dead were Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino cannery workers returning to San Francisco at the end of the long summer canning season. They had been towed to sea from Wrangell, down the windy bend of Sumner Strait, through the islands of southeast Alaska, out to the wide open Pacific Ocean. They almost made it. Wrangell clamored for answers, and the crew had a story to tell. Here, in their own words, are the final hours of the Star of Bengal. Nicholas Wagner, Captain, Star of Bengal. I was called from the cabin at 1:45 on Sunday morning and found the wind freshening from the southeast. The first intimation of danger was the sound of breakers alongside. It was readily clear that we had been towed too close into shoal. I endeavored to get the ship on starboard tack and tried to hail steamers by use of megaphone and foghorn to draw their attention to the proximity of the land, yelling, "Starboard! Starboard!" till I got hoarse, but I got no response of any kind from either steamer. On deck I saw through the darkness breakers all round, from the starboard bow to the port quarter, a small reef on the port side and the land towering black and forbidding about 300 yards away. We heaved 2 anchors, but the wind drew us nearer to shore. I ordered anchors let go in 17 fathoms of water, which held the ship, the towing steamers cutting the hawsers shortly afterwards. 15 minutes more of towing, a half hour at the most, would have taken our ship free of the lee shore and into the Pacific. They put off like cowards while we drifted to death. The ship was not wrested from them by force of the storm. The tugs cut loose, then ran like dogs. I used the megaphone, tried it for hours without number, and yelled to no purpose. Gabriel with his trumpets might have made them hear us, but it would have done no good.
Before things got so bad, the men, many of whom, like myself, knew the fellows on the tugs personally, paced up and down the decks while the captain burned blue fire. Later, as the danger grew and the men realized how they were caught like rats in a trap, some of them strode here and there like mad men.
All donned lifebelts, some of us aiding the Chinese, who did not know how to manage them. For 4 hours, the Star of Bengal rode at anchor, during which time every man aboard might have been saved. We were lying in 7 fathoms with comparatively no wind. At any time between daylight and 8 o'clock, the tugs could have come alongside and rescued all. I called for volunteers, and 4 men came forward. As every tragedy furnishes its heroes, ours came into existence with a call for volunteers to man a lifeboat to carry a buoy line ashore. Into what seemed certain death, Harry Lewald, Olaf Hansen, and Fred Matson, sailors, and Frank Muir, a cannery cook, came forward. With their safe landing depended the safety of the 134 men who remained on the ship.
We had to do something. It was time for action, and someone had to go ashore in that boat and get out a lifeline.
Then Fred Matson and I jumped into the port lifeboat, where Olaf Hansen and Harry Lewald were sitting, and we took the oars, while the others stood by to cut the falls as soon as she touched the water.
The surf gave us a hard struggle. It surged back and forth until I thought we would never get it on the beach. Finally, we made it fast to a rock. I rigged the breeches buoy to a tree on top of the bluff.
Martin Carstensen thought the chance was one for life, and slid with the breeches buoy away from the ship landward.
About halfway over, the ship careened to one side, throwing the chair and man 60 feet in the air and dropping him down against the breakers, which roared beneath his feet. As he went up with another roll of the ship, he clambered out of the chair and sailed high into the air, landing in the foaming waves.
Seeing that the vessel would break up shortly and litter the sea with wreckage, I asked the men to jump and swim, but they preferred to remain with me to the last. The ship struck at 9:45 a.m. As she struck, every man aboard was thrown from his feet,
One Japanese who went up the mizzenmast was torn from the rigging by the plunging of the ship and fell headlong to the ship where his brains spilled on the deck. Others were in the rigging when it was shaken out of the ship and carried overboard.
The Chinese were objects of pity in their helplessness. Many were drowned outright, others were crippled or killed in the falling wreckage and floating piles of salmon cases.
Swimmers had but little chance in the water, as the waves looked like solid walls of salmon cases and gasoline tanks. Probably as many were crushed by wreckage as were drowned.
The poor fellows could not swim well in the wreckage, which was filled with all manner of debris. Every huge wave rolling shoreward looked like a wall of salmon cases.
The great danger was that the cases would dash their brains out before we could reach them. Peter Peterson shouted, "Grab me, Harry, grab me!" But the wreckage prevented, and by the time we got near him, an awful breaker full of cases and drums broke right on top of him, and we saw him no more.
The waves were running 20 feet high, and the poor fellows deserted there by the tugs were clinging as best they could to the rail or in the rigging.
Then what we have been expecting to happen any moment happened. A large babe lifted her up sky high and smashed her down on a rock.
We could see the ship rolling and plunging through the rain and sleet. Soon her foremast went and she broke in two at that point. Then part of the mainmast went over and the mizzenmast was carried away. The pitching of the vessel was horrible and sickened one to watch it. The little black dots representing human figures, showing at the distance huddled like so many sheep near on the poop far astern. My brother was among that number, and it was plain to be seen that all could not survive.
The Star of Bengal appeared to heave up her entrails in 3 sections when the final shot came. If I live to get to a place where it can be done, I propose to bring charges against the 2 men who were acting as captains of the tugs. To them alone do I blame the loss of life that has resulted. Those 2 captains are criminally cowardly and will have to answer to authorities and to God for the 110 human lives. If there is any law under which I can do it, I will send both of those tugboat captains to San Quentin for their cowardice. These quotes splashed the front pages of newspapers along the West Coast. It was a sensational story, but it contained a lie. A lie too big to be an accident and too useful to be an oversight. For the rise and fall of the Star of Bengal is a story with truth, lies, legends, and a mystery sitting at the bottom of the sea. I'm your host, Ronan Rooney. You're listening to The Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal, presented by Wrangell History Unlocked. Our first episode, A Star is Born. Fast forward to Wrangell, 1981. The Star of Bengal is a distant memory. But there is a man in Wrangell who remembers it, who was there as the ship was towed out to sea, and saw the Star of Bengal on its final night. His name is Bill Taylor. Bill was 12 years old, and aboard the lead steamship towing the Star of Bengal, the Hattie Gage. His father, William Sr., secured a job aboard the Hattie Gage as an assistant engineer and brought his young son along for the ride. It was a trip Bill never forgot. In 1981, at the age of 86, Bill Taylor sat down and told his story into a tape recorder.
Of course, I didn't see anything but what I was doing.
You sure worked hard down there shoveling coal.
Shoveling coal, well, I was just handling the door for my dad.
Yeah?
And the regular fireman, a little, a pretty big Filipino boy. He was the regular fireman on there.
The young woman you hear is an Episcopal Church volunteer. She wanted to capture Wrangell's oldest stories before they disappeared forever. She is also my mother, Alice Rooney. For decades, she kept these tapes in a shoebox. In 2007, she gave them to me.
Well, I cried. I had to go. I was 11 years old. So, Dad didn't want me to go, and neither did Mother. The school, I I said, heck, you're only 2 days. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'll be back to school. Oh, well, I begged so hard that they finally let me go.
Born in 1895, Bill is Tlingit through his mother and white through his father. My mother remembers Bill Taylor as a master storyteller. There's one piece of the Star of Bengal story that Bill tells that still shocks her.
Well, they cut the lines from the kayak because it had to be cut. She was pulling us out of control.
Yeah.
And we lost her power, and we didn't have enough power to buck the wind and the waves to keep the ship off of the reef.
Yeah.
And when the ship went over on the reef, she had 90,000 cases of salmon aboard. And she had 92 Chinamen and workers, white workers on there, besides the deck load. And of course the hatch was all battened down, canvas battened down over the side and fastened real tight. That made the hole inside of the ship airtight. And that's where the Chinese was, we had the Chinese locked up. So when she hit this reef, she began to pound on the bottom like that, and the weight of the ship was going down all the time, and the water and the air inside of the ship began to compress, and it compressed to the point where it blew the hatch covers wide open like that with the Chinese and the salmon. There were 97,000 cases of salmon packed in that ship. I didn't see all that, but I know it, how it happened. Hey, boy, that was some night.
The scene Bill describes is horrific, thoughtless, and unconscionable. Asian men separated and locked below deck as the ship sank, crushed and drowned as the ship slipped beneath the surface of the ocean. Of 106 Asian cannery workers on board, only 10 survived. This fatal outcome seems to support Bill's grim story. And Bill isn't alone. In 1922, undercover reporter Max Stern went inside the hold of an APA ship and heard the legend by lamplight. Tom told me of the Star of Bengal, which went on the rocks in southeast Alaska. The sailors, so the legend goes, battered down the scuttle of the Chinese hold to save themselves. It was their intent that the Chinese crew would perish while they got the boats. But it helped them not at all, for most of them drowned too. In 1960, sailing historian Harold Hike mentioned the legend in passing. There was the Star of Bengal, gone these 50 years, with the bones of 100 Chinese entombed in her rusted hulk. The legend appeared in the 2001 documentary Sockeye and the Age of Sail, quoting Jonas Simonson, born years after the Star of Bengal wreck. Tradition says that in case the ship was sinking at sea, the China gang would be locked down in the hold where they'd stay and let go down with the ship without any chance to save themselves. The legend hangs like a dark cloud that never goes away, an everlasting reminder of racial segregation. Versions of this story have survived over a century, but there are reasons to doubt the legend is true. This is just one of many mysteries surrounding the Star of Bengal. To make sense of it all, we have to go back to the beginning, the very beginning. Our story begins in India. Bengal is an ancient region, a place where rivers and the Indian Ocean collide. It is a place along Asia's Great Silk Road. Centuries of trade built empires and spurred advances in science, art, and culture. Bengal's rich, fertile farmland provided abundant raw materials. In the Age of Sail, Europeans sent ships to Bengal to trade for gold, spices, textiles, and more. The journey took them around Africa and deep into the furthest reaches of the Indian Ocean. Many European powers tried, and failed, to control the India trade. But the British East India Company succeeded. In the middle of the 18th century, with support from the British Crown and Parliament, the company put down Indian insurrections, seized the power to collect taxes, and expanded its control over the Indian subcontinent. One of the most valuable and strategic centers of power was Bengal. By the middle of the 1800s, the East India Company was merely a formality. Everyone knew the real power in India was the British Crown. Queen Victoria established a puppet government in India called the British Raj. Though the East India Company's influence waned, the same goal remained: money. Intellectual and mathematician Dadabhai Naoroji, known as the Grand Old Man of India, looked around and saw the once prosperous empire turn into famine and poverty. He coined the analogy that would define the British policy in India for the rest of history. He said, "Materially, the political drain up to this time from India to England is above 500 million at the lowest computation in principle alone. The further continuation of this drain at the rate at present or above 12 million per annum with a tendency to increase." The drain of wealth became an influential rallying cry in India. On the other side of the world, in Belfast, Ireland, shipping magnate J.P. Corey saw an opportunity. "1874 is the year it all came together. At the beginning of the year, J.P. Corey joined Parliament, giving him an opportunity to shape British policy in India and around the world. J.P. Corey owned an impressive fleet of large, iron square-rigged sailing ships. He used them for shipping cargo around the world. It started with the Star of Erin in 1862, named for his mother. It was 949 gross tons and 200 feet long. He commissioned more ships, each one larger and more grand than the last. There was the Star of Denmark, the Star of Scotia, the Star of Albion, the Star of Persia, the Star of Greece, and, by 1872, the Star of Germany. And they called it the Star Fleet. Each ship was personally designed and constructed for J.P. Corey by two men who used science and engineering to usher in the golden age of sail: Harland and Wolff. Harland and Wolff occupied an inlet on the northeastern shore of Northern Ireland, at the mouth of the River Lagan, surrounded by timber across the sea from Britain. It was an ideal place to build the ships that would change the world and put Belfast on the map. Harland and Wolff transformed Belfast, drawing thousands of workers to their shipyards. By 1872, after 12 years of shipbuilding for J.P. Corey, Harland and Wolff managed to add 335 tons and 32 feet of length compared to their first ship for J.P. Corey, the Star of Erin. But J.P. Corey needed a bigger boat. With the doors of India wide open, J.P. Corey tasked Harland and Wolff with building him something bigger and better than ever before. It featured a deep, cavernous hull capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo. It was 262 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 22.5 feet deep, with a concrete weather deck. Its bulging black hull was made from steel. Shortly after New Year's 1874, the Freeman's Journal reported, "On Saturday was launched from the extensive iron shipbuilding yard of Messrs. Harland and Wolff, Belfast, the largest sailing ship which was ever built in Ireland, and one of the largest of the kind afloat. She is for the firm of Mr. J.P. Corey and Company of Belfast, and is the 9th of the splendid fleet of vessels which they have engaged in the London and Calcutta trade. Her name is the Star of Bengal." J.P. Corey wasted no time putting the Star of Bengal to work. Newspapers around the world reported its arrival and departure. It was frequently photographed sitting in harbor. The Star of Bengal's first journey to Australia was an unforgettable one. Melbourne's The Age newspaper wrote, "The ship Star of Bengal, which has been hovering about off this port for the last week, has at length arrived. She is a very handsome clipper of 1,797 tons register and a remarkably fast sailor, but being on her first voyage, the rigging was continually stretching, so that when a fair opportunity of testing her full powers occurred, it had to be done with the utmost caution. Her masts and yards are of iron, the lower mast and topmast being in one, and some idea of their appearance may be formed from the length of the mainmast, which is from heel to masthead 132 feet 6 inches. The passage out of the Star of Bengal has, during the latter part, been very stormy, and several mishaps occurred, one being the loss of a passenger, who was either washed or fell overboard during a gale, and was not missed until the following day. Another was the smashing up of the horse boxes and the death of one of the animals, a very fine draft horse, and another was the parting of all the running pendants from the braces, both of topsail and topgallant yards. The man who died left behind an orphaned son aboard the Star of Bengal," the paper wrote. A little boy 10 years of age named Benjamin Hazel was brought up as a neglected child. The child's father was a passenger by the ship Star of Bengal and was washed overboard on a voyage from India about 3 months since. As soon as the vessel arrived in Melbourne, the little fellow was handed over to the police as a neglected child and was given in charge of a respectable woman. He has several times been brought before court and remanded in order to allow of some respectable person adopting him. When he was again brought before the court yesterday, and about being sent to the training ship for 3 years, a person named Martin offered to adopt him as a son. The little fellow seemed highly delighted that he had escaped being sent to the ship. 1 week later, the Star of Bengal was back in the news when it collided with another ship, punching holes in the iron bulwarks. Several years later, on December 10, 1880, newspapers reported the tragic news that the Star of Bengal sunk. A collision occurred on Saturday night between two large English iron ships, the Corby and the Star of Bengal. The Star of Bengal, which was from London to Calcutta with salt, fell across the bows of the Corby, which had a jib-boom carried away and other damage. The vessels were in collision nearly 10 minutes. After parting, a boat was seen to be lowered from the Star of Bengal, and then she disappeared. The officers of the Corby believe her to have sunk with all hands. And yet, the Star of Bengal had not sunk. On December 15, the London Daily News reported a telegram from the Star of Bengal, confirming the collision, but requesting no assistance. The Star of Bengal lived to sail another day. When it first appeared on the horizon, it was just a speck. But gradually, it came closer, building up speed. Soon it would pass everyone and bring the golden age of sail to an end. It was the steamship. To operate, steamships burned coal, heating water, which forced an engine to move. They could break, even explode, and required constant fuel. But scientific innovation and engineering improved on the design, making them safer and more reliable. Steamships did not require wind to navigate, and they could more nimbly move around inland passageways. They reduced trips of weeks down to days. Harland and Wolff always wanted to put a steam engine inside J.P. Corey's ships. J.P. Corey refused. He was not interested in new technology. But another client of Harland and Wolff was interested. White Star Line commissioned the world's first 3 steam-powered ocean liners, Oceanic, Atlantic, and the Baltic. The ships were a success. Years later, in 1912, White Star Line commissioned its biggest ocean liner ever, the Titanic. By the end of the century, steamships put square-rigged sailing ships out of business. The golden age of sail was over. J.P. Corey's Starfleet began to look like relics of the past. In June 1898, J.P. Corey sold the Star of Bengal to San Francisco businessman J.J. Smith. Smith found a new home for the Star of Bengal, a place where it could ride out its years sailing in warm seas with miles of open ocean in all directions. The Star of Bengal was going to Hawaii. The Hawaiian Islands were a fitting retirement for the Star of Bengal. It would spend the rest of its life in wide, open tropical seas. In March 1899, the Star of Bengal nearly exploded, the San Francisco Chronicle reported. The ship Star of Bengal, from Newcastle, Australia to San Francisco with coal for J.J. Smith and Company, put into Honolulu Wednesday, with her coal getting hot and almost ready to break out in flames. Captain Henderson asked for a board of survey, which recommended that all or part of her cargo be discharged here, as conditions should require, and she is now discharging. But the coal wasn't the only thing getting hot. When the Star of Bengal first arrived in the Hawaiian Islands, the Republic of Hawaii teetered on collapse. It was a government only 4 years old, established after American landowners staged a coup of Hawaii's sovereign queen, Liliuokalani. While under house arrest, Liliuokalani transcribed her own songs, including one which became a popular anthem, Aloha Oi. Several months after the Star of Bengal arrived in Hawaii, the Republic of Hawaii collapsed. The United States officially annexed the islands, along with everyone and everything inside. And that included the Star of Bengal. For its whole existence, the Star of Bengal sailed as a registered ship of Ireland, where it was designed and built. On June 6, 1900, the United States Congress changed that.
Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the Commissioner of Navigation is hereby authorized and directed to cause the foreign-built ship Star of Italy and foreign-built ship Star of Bengal, owned by citizens of the United States or citizens of Hawaii, to be registered as vessels of the United States.
With that, the Star of Bengal became an American. But the future was still uncertain. The Star of Bengal was enormous, expensive, and a relic of a bygone era. Whole neighborhoods in San Francisco were constructed from the scraps of old sailing ships, showing they were sometimes more valuable in pieces than at sea. In order to entice a buyer, Smith's company took one piece of the Star of Bengal away forever. Smith's company stripped the third mast of its spars, sails, and rigging. They turned the Star of Bengal into a bark. This was a simpler design, one that required less people and gear to operate. The only trade-off was less wind power. Anyone interested in buying the Star of Bengal had to be willing to spend more time at sea. It worked. Smith's company received an invitation from across town from another San Francisco company. The Alaska Packers Association was calling. For years, the Alaska Packers Association acquired the remnants of J.P. Corey's Starfleet. The ships sat clustered together like towering skyscrapers along the waterfront of the San Francisco Bay. It was said to be the largest private navy in the world. Just 13 years before purchasing the Star of Bengal, the Alaska Packers Association was nothing. In the 1890s, small independent canneries around southeast Alaska threatened to destroy each other. When they showed up at markets in places like Seattle or San Francisco, they all sold basically the same product, canned salmon. To compete, they slashed prices, cutting profits to nothing, even taking losses just to make a sale. They should have been making a killing, Instead, they were killing each other. To break the cycle, they took a new approach. They stopped competing and began colluding. Working together, they could share expenses, and most important, set a fixed price for canned salmon. This arrangement became the Alaska Packers Association. Despite its name, it was a thoroughly San Francisco company, and its president for its first 30 years was one man, Henry Fortman. He began as the heir to a San Francisco beer brewery established by his German immigrant father. Henry invested the family business profits into other ventures. A newspaper clipping about Henry's son foreshadowed the family future in the salmon industry. Emil Fortman, the 10-year-old son of Henry Fortman of Alameda, while bathing in the surf near Schuetzen Park, secured a salmon weighing 15 pounds by means of stabbing it 6 times with a pocket knife. For 30 years, Henry Fortman was the APA. He proved a shrewd steward of the Alaska Packers Association. Where competition drove down prices, he simply colluded. In 1897, the Emporia Gazette wrote, President Henry Fortman of the Alaska Packers Association and Managing Superintendent H.J. Barting of the Alaska Fruit Company have arranged to combine instead of competing, as heretofore in the salmon industry, thus raising the price of canned product all over the country. Henry Fortman made grand gestures for charity and publicity. In 1898, American troops stationed in San Francisco received a letter from Henry Fortman. Dear Sir, believing that canned salmon would prove a welcome addition to the Army rations, we take the liberty of sending you 4,800 cans of king salmon, which you will please distribute among the troops at your post. Yours truly, Alaska Packers Association, Henry Fortman, President. The company thrived. The business model was simple. Men signed a contract in San Francisco, sailed up to Alaska for the summer, and got paid when they came back home. In 1900, one group of men working at Pyramid Harbor learned the hard way. Be careful what you agree to. To help us out, here's a song by R.B. Craswell memorializing this famous event.
Come all you bold sailors who fish for your pay, I'll sing you a song from a time when they say that the salmon ran thick and were heavy as sin, and the canneries caught 'em and wrapped 'em in tin. It was haul away Johnny and haul again strong, you'll be hauling these nets for the whole season long, so attend to the story of what can go wrong if you're sailing to Pyramid Harbor.
At the Pyramid Harbor Cannery, the APA paid fishermen either $50 or $60 for the summer, plus an incentive of 2 cents per red salmon a man might catch. This was enough to get men to sign on in San Francisco, but once they got to Alaska, reality set in.
But it's haul away Johnny and haul again strong, we'll be hauling these nets for the whole season long, so attend to this story of what can go wrong if you're sailing to Pyramid Harbor.
The fishermen protested. They'd been given lousy nets, which let too many fish through. The APA manager said,
You know, for our profits, we need those fish too, so we've chosen the nets both for us and for you.
Was it really about the nets? Was it about something more, like the conditions, the food, the dorms, or that the pay really was low? It's hard to say. But what happened next would set off a chain of events that still holds precedent to this day.
So the others rejected the boss's defense, but the step they took next didn't make too much sense. They said to the boss he must double our pay, or we'd walk off the job on that very same day. Now we all of us knew that this wasn't too shrewd, 'cause the canneries owned all the ships and the food. You don't walk off a ship in some far northern bay. But the boss said, you win and we'll double your pay.
The fishermen celebrated. They fought the APA and won. For once, they had the APA over a barrel. The men worked the whole season through, and sailed back to San Francisco. When they got home, they were in for a surprise.
When we got back to Frisco and asked for our pay, we politely were told we could jump in the bay. Then they spoke of our duty and spoke of our greed, and they said we'd exploited the cannery's need. We had already promised the work that they got, and a promise is sacred except when it's not. Remember this song when you're safely in port. Though your pay may be nasty and brutish and short, you'll do better by far if you stay out of port and stay farther from Pyramid Harbor.
The fishermen sued and lost. They'd made a bargain and had to stick to it. The case became a famous legal precedent, Alaska Packers Association versus Domenico, one still taught in law schools today. Henry Fortman did well as president of the APA. At the age of 39, Henry Fortman purchased a large, ornate San Francisco mansion for $42,500, around $1.5 million today. The Fortman Mansion became a San Francisco landmark. In 1905, the Seattle Daily Times wrote, "The association, which controlled about 2/3 of the pack of the season just closed, is the largest institution of its kind in the world, it is said, and being so, with its base of operations in San Francisco, thousands of miles from the canneries in Alaskan waters, is viewed by stockholders and by well-informed jobbers as being top-heavy. Harsh criticism on the part of the stockholders of the company has arisen because of the slump in the stock of the company and other events. It appears that all power to handle the operating work of the company as well as its finances is vested in President Fortman." Buying up J.P. Corey's Starfleet was all part of Henry Fortman's strategy. He didn't mind that sailing ships weren't as fast as steamships. After all, he only needed his ships to travel twice a year, once to Alaska and once back. And canned salmon didn't spoil. Sailing historian Harold Hike described it like this: "The waters of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest teemed with salmon. The relative inaccessibility of the fishing grounds called for ships that could sail across more than 2,000 miles of open, oft-times stormy seas, and bring a season's pack of salmon home in the fall. Supplies and workmen could be taken to the cannery and fishing sites by sea only. The need for ships of large carrying capacity was thus obvious." And the lack of passenger space didn't bother Fortman either. Henry Fortman looked below deck into the deep, dark, cavernous hold. Once built to store cargo, Henry Fortman used this space to store men. It took time for Asian labor to become the main workforce inside canneries. In the mid-1800s, American demand for Chinese labor brought many young Chinese men to the United States. They built railroads in California and began settling along the West Coast, some of them starting families. But this caused racial panic among white Americans, who fought back. In 1882, President Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred immigration from China and led to a wave of immigration from Japan and the Philippines. In 1885, a white mob, including future Alaska politician Judge James Wickersham, invaded a Chinese immigrant community in Tacoma, Washington, destroyed homes, and forced everyone onto a train for Portland, Oregon. The group were hailed as local heroes. In 1886, in Juneau, Alaska, 100 Chinese miners were rounded up, packed onto a steamship, and sent to Wrangell. 2 years later, in Juneau, Chinese miners were bombed while asleep, destroying their building, leaving them injured. White Americans saw Chinese men as an economic opportunity, but a social threat. As Asian labor grew as the bedrock of the cannery business, this tension held. By design, the Alaska Packers Association kept its Asian cannery workers at arm's length. These men were strictly contractors, not employees. The Alaska Packers Association vested responsibility for the Asian workers with a single contract holder, who was responsible for paying each worker, even including food and provisions. Jack Chen, writing in the Chinese of America, says, "Conditions of work in the canneries were such that rascally contractors could and did exploit the packers, greatly increasing the hardships they faced under normal contracts that set low wages, minimal amenities in living, and long hours of hard work. A packer had to agree to an 11-hour workday, on demand until the canning of the hauls of fish was done. Contractors sold the packers shoddy outfits at high prices, demanded kickbacks, and doctored accounts. 77% of a gang of packers might be illiterate, so it was easy to take advantage of them." In 1908, the same year the Star of Bengal sank, one group of cannery workers returned from Alaska, only to find out the contract holder had run off with the money. The San Francisco Chronicle reported, "A turbulent crowd of disappointed cannery hands recently arrived in this city from Alaska, blockaded DuPont Street yesterday afternoon, and for a few minutes a riot seemed imminent. Kwangham, Was and Company had taken the contract from the Alaska Packers Association to furnish laborers. 72 of all nationalities were supplied, and these, after working at the canneries in the north, returned 5 days ago. The Chinese company had subcontracted with Sotaro Okuda and Kei Irie, and yesterday delivered into the subcontractors' hands between $2,000 and $3,000 in gold coin to pay off the laborers. Okuda acknowledged having received the money and assured the police that he had given it in turn to Irie to pay the men. He said Irie had suddenly absconded with the gold, and although he had searched for him frantically, he was not to be found." Chinese cannery workers also risked coming home at the end of the long season just to be arrested before getting off the boat. In September 1903, the San Francisco Call carried one example under the headline, "Big Haul of Chinese." 24 Chinese fishermen returning from Alaska canneries on board the Agate were taken into custody yesterday by the Chinese Bureau in order that the resident certificates presented might be examined. This threatened the way the canned salmon industry did business. In 1907, the industry appealed to Congress for a relaxation of the Chinese Exclusion Act by allowing bonded immigrants to enter the country, or else the industry might produce less salmon. The canned salmon industry needed Chinese labor. Japanese, Filipino, and other Asian immigrant groups entered to fill the need. These men needed pay, but also a chance to work among their peers in a place separate from the troubles of life in the cities. The masterful history of canned salmon in Alaska, Tin Can Country, features a description of the canning process from government agent Howard Cutchin. Here is an abridged version. "The fish are carried on the vessel's deck and are pitched upon the wharf. The butcher, seizing a fish by the tail, with one stroke beheads it. With another sweep of his long, sharp knife, he removes the back fins. With a quick twist, he throws up the belly and slices off the under fins. One swift cut lays it open, and about 2 or 3 scrapes take out the roe and entrails. Another cut removes the tail, and all of the body fit for use is pushed into a tank of fresh water. The slimers hook the fish from the water and carefully complete the cleaning operation. It goes into another tank of water, and after being taken from this, is placed upon a draining table. They are dumped on the floor beside the cutter, which has a revolving carrier on the principle of an endless chain, with receptacles taking 1 fish each. This passes under a cylinder with 4 blades, which cuts the fish into 5 pieces. The 3 inner pieces are pushed into a long inclined spout, which carries the meat to the filler. The meat is fed into a hopper by 2 men. The cans come down a spout from the loft in an endless stream. Before the cans are sent down, 1/4 of an ounce of salt is put in each. Cleaned salmon are poured out at the other end and onto a table surrounded by 8 or 10 Chinese men, who in turn clean off any scraps, weigh an occasional can, and put in or take out meat as occasion requires. They are passed on to men who place a bit of scrap tin on top of the meat. This is done to protect it from the muriatic acid which is used in soldering vents. They go along to the toppers, who place the tops by hand. They are carried to the crimping machine which fastens the tops on. The cans go into a chute. a groove in one side of which is filled with molten solder, which is kept in a liquid state by a row of jets of flame. As the cans roll along, they take up all the solder required to render them airtight. They run under a stream of water to cool and harden the solder. The tops have small vents in them to permit the escape of gases. The vents are soldered up. The trays are submerged in hot water test kettles and leaks detected by bubbles. The trays run on a tramway into the steam chest. Here, the first cooking is done, the cans remaining in the chest from 45 minutes to an hour. Each can is vented with a wooden hammer with a short, sharp nail in its head. The steam and water spurt up a foot or more. The holes are at once soldered up by 2 men. Cooking is repeated for 1 hour. The racks are submerged in lye kettles to remove all grease and dirt. They are scrubbed and put under a stream of cold water. The trays are left 24 hours to thoroughly cool. The cans are again tested for leaks by an expert operator who taps each one on the top with a tiny hammer. The cans are transferred to the lacquer vats, dipped into a preparation composition of rosin and turpentine, which gives them the golden brownish color. The cans are piled in great pyramids. After labeling, they are left until the paste is thoroughly dry. They are once more tested and are ready for the case. This process became so associated with Asian labor, when Edmund Smith invented a machine to replace these workers, he called it the iron chink. It was a slur, one that revealed both the contempt for and reliance on Asian labor. The invention was successful, revolutionized canned salmon, and pushed the industry to new heights. Some men spent the whole season assembling wooden cases for the finished canned salmon. Estimates vary, but each case may have weighed around 65 pounds. Business measured success by the case. Each case was the physical symbol of everyone's labor, a growing mountain created by hard work. And yet, in the wreck of the Star of Bengal, it was these cases that would cause the greatest loss of life. Next time on the rise and fall of the Star of Bengal, it's farewell San Francisco, hello Alaska. It's the summer of 1908 and the salmon are running. What nobody knows is that this will be the last voyage of the Star of Bengal. All that and hell ships next time on Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal. Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal is a Wrangell History Unlocked production. Music from today's episode, Mars from the Planets, performed by the President's Own United States Marine Band. The Star-Spangled Banner, performed by the United States Air Force Band. William Tell Overture, performed by the United States Marine Corps Band. Sitar and Tabla Duo, performed by Bruce Miller from the Free Music Archives. Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from archive.org. Stompin' Jazz Night from Epidemic Sounds. Alexander Archipelago, written and performed by Alice Rooney. Remaining songs from the Wikipedia Commons. Whiskey You're the Devil by Edith Kovacs. Also Sprach Zarathustra, Shenyang, and Corncob, provided by Kevin MacLeod. Waltzing Matilda by unknown artists. Jupiter from the Planets, performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra. Aloha Oi, performed by William Smith and Walter K. Kolomaku. Fur Elise, performed by Sebion7125. Sound effects from epidemicsound.com. Thanks to our voice talent, John Schenk, Jake Henry, and Tyler Knabb. Thanks to R.B. Craswell for the amazing song, Sailing to Pyramid Harbor. Check out R.B. Craswell's other songs on YouTube. Thanks to Bonnie Demersion, Alice Rooney, and Steve Lloyd for offering feedback on early drafts of this episode. Bonnie Demersion is the author of several wonderful books on Wrangell history, and Steve Lloyd is the author of 2 gripping articles about the Star of Bengal, published in 2001 in the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society's journal, The Sea Chest. Thanks to the eternal spirit of William Taylor, and thanks to Alice Rooney for capturing his voice and sharing so much more. You can learn more about the Star of Bengal at wrangellhistoryunlocked.com/star. You can read a transcript of today's episode, along with photos, maps, a timeline, and more. Think you have a piece of this story that you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. There are many mysteries about the Star of Bengal just waiting to be solved. You can email us at wrangellpod@gmail.com. Tune in next week for our second episode. Farewell. I'm your host, Ronan Rooney. Thanks for listening.